Good afternoon. Thank you for coming, those who are here in the sanctuary, and thank you for tuning in, those of you who are at home, tuning in by one of our connections. We appreciate all of you being here. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes talking about why we're doing this concert and how this concert's put together. The COVID-19 pandemic is 2 years old, as we have heard in the news media the last week or so, but it certainly seems a lot longer. Here's a short history of the pandemic. January 30, 2020, the World Health Organization declares the coronavirus/COVID-19 outbreak a public health emergency. February 29, 2020, the first COVID-19 death is reported in the United States. But March is when everything changed. March 9, 2020, Italy places itself on a nationwide quarantine to slow the spread of coronavirus. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged more than 2,000 points. The pace picks up. March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization upgrades the coronavirus outbreak to a pandemic. Governor Gavin Newsom says that California has at least 157 confirmed cases. The NBA suspends its season indefinitely because of the pandemic. Major League Baseball suspends spring training. The NFL calls off annual off-season meetings. The NHL and Major League Soccer suspend their regular seasons. The NCAA cancels its basketball championship tournaments. March 13, 2020, exactly 2 years ago today, it was a Friday in 2020, President Trump declares the coronavirus outbreak a national emergency and shuts down the nation, asking everyone to stay at home. We all get to know our families and our homes better, and we all learn to Zoom. In case you have forgotten, here are some images from those days. Healthcare workers in Washington State put a patient into an ambulance February 29, 2020, at the Life Care Center of Kirkland, where dozens of staffers and residents were exhibiting COVID-19 symptoms. Sacramento Kings guard Buddy Hield on the court before the scheduled start of March 11, 2020 game against the New Orleans Pelicans that was canceled after another NBA player tested positive for COVID. Something unheard of. The interchange of the 101 and the 110 freeways in downtown Los Angeles is mostly empty at midday, March 19, 2020, during the stay-at-home orders. People wait in line for coronavirus testing at Dodger Stadium on June 25, 2020. 9 months later, similar lines would grow for vaccinations. Despite all the dire predictions, we have survived. Civilization has survived. God still reigns, and we must move forward. Today's concert salutes all of us survivors, as well as those we have lost, the healthcare workers who keep us alive, and the God who loves us and who looks over us. In 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, the Apostle Paul states it well. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and sound mind. For the next few minutes, I'll discuss some of the music we will present in this concert. One of the most powerful hymns of faith has no remarkable storyline. Thomas Chisholm, the author of Great Is Thy Faithfulness and 1,200 other poems, was born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1866. He lived a pretty unremarkable life. He worked as a school teacher, a newspaper editor, and an insurance agent. His hymn, "Great is Thy Faithfulness," was inspired by the simple realization that God is at work in our lives on a daily basis. Chisholm wrote, "My income has not been large at any time due to impaired health in the early years, which has followed me on until now. Although I must not fail to record here the unfailing faithfulness of a covenant-keeping God, and that God has given me many wonderful displays of providing care, for which I am filled with astonishing gratefulness." The next work, 7 O'Clock Shout, is a work composed during the pandemic. Composer Valerie Coleman, pictured on this slide, talks about her work. These are her words. 7 O'Clock Shout is an anthem inspired by the tireless frontline workers during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the heartwarming ritual of evening serenades that bring people together amidst isolation to celebrate life and the sacrifices of heroes. The work begins with a distant and solitary solo between two trumpets in fanfare fashion to commemorate the isolation forced upon humankind and the need to reach out to one another. The fanfare blossoms into blushly dense landscape of nature, symbolizing both the caring acts of nurses and doctors as they try to save lives, while nature is transforming and healing herself during a time of self-isolation. The title celebrates the practice of many city dwellers early in the pandemic who went out on their porches, balconies, rooftops to shout, sing, clang pots and pans, clap, and thank the frontline medical community for keeping us alive. The first recording of this work was by the Philadelphia Orchestra performing virtually, i.e., that means individually from their homes. One of the devices that Valerie Coleman uses to keep the group together despite their isolation is the usage of what we call ostinato. It's a rhythmic motif repeated over and over to generate forward motion, and in this case kind of establishes a groove. The ostinato patterns here are laid down first in the bass section, gradually building up to that moment at 7 p.m. when cheers, claps, clanging of bells, pots and pans and shouts ring through the air in cities around the country and even around the world. The work ends in a proud anthem moment where we all come together with grateful hearts to acknowledge that we have survived yet another day. As we play this work, we shall show a video honoring the many frontline medical workers who have given and continue to give their lives to keep us alive. A requiem for the living is unusual in that requiems are typically written for the dead. However, this work is a prayer for rest. In other words, requiem, rest, for the living, for us as much as for the deceased. Its message is, grant us rest, even more than grant them rest. Rest is, after all, something we all need, even more as we now are into year 3 of the COVID-19 pandemic. The composer Dan Forrest, from South Carolina, by the way, discusses his requiem. The first movement pours out the grief of the requiem in Kyrie prayers, facing grief head-on and grappling with the sorrow that is common in all human existence. And it was embodied in the experiences of Job, who he later quotes in the piece. The second movement bitterly portrays the problem of pain that we all wrestle with, which causes a crisis of faith for many of us. It expounds on the vanity of vanities, all is vanity, refrain from the book of Ecclesiastes, with no small amount of anger and bitterness and rage against the machine. The middle section quotes Job, who is the best biblical example we have of the challenges of pain, and even as he says in his darkest moment, It would have been better if I hadn't been born. Composer Dan Forrest goes on and to describe the third movement, which is the Agnus Dei, out of its traditional order, because at this point in writing the piece, I, Dan Forrest, need to see the Lamb of God, who died to redeem humankind from all fallenness, vanity, pain, sorrow, and destruction. Forrest continues, my setting of the Sanctus text in the fourth movement is literally a depiction of God's wondrous glory in three different places. The universe, inspired by that ultra-deep field picture from the Hubble telescope that you're seeing here. Earth, as viewed from the orbiting International Space Station. And finally, humankind, God's wondrous image bearers who demonstrate God's glory even more directly than all of the rest of the wonders of the heavens. So there are three sections to this movement. The first is an ethereal section for the Hubble image. The second is a warmer section that starts to come down to earth with more motion, eventually grows very majestic, and then finally a bustling, energetic, fast final section coming right down in the middle of a city, teeming with the life and energy of a metropolis full of these image bearers who are even more wondrous part of creation than the heavens themselves. As you might imagine, we'll show a video of those images from the space station, from the Hubble telescope. The final movement is simply an arrival at rest and peace, not just in the presentation, the realization of eternal light, which God offers those who seek him, but even here and now for us, the living on earth. Our requiem, our rest is found in Jesus Christ. I purposely quoted, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Because it's the answer to the introit's prayer for rest. The answer to that prayer is already given there in Matthew 11. Christ is our rest. Requiem aeternam, rest. We'll also do some familiar hymns on this concert. And we all know the great hymn, How Great Thou Art, but very few of us know the fascinating international history that brought it to the fore. In 1885, Carl Boberg was walking home to a little town in a coastal village in Sweden. He was caught in a terrible storm. Just as he made it home to his small house, the storm stopped and the sun came out suddenly. Boberg went inside, sat down, and wrote a poem in Swedish, O Stora Gut. It didn't get much notoriety. 1925, Samuel Hines heard the poem in Ukraine, translated into Russian, while he was there as a missionary. Hines translated it to English and took a lot of liberties with the text. Edwin Orr, in the 1950s, while in India as a missionary, heard the translation into English, which by then had been set to music, and he brought it home to the U.S. He began to share How Great Thou Art as part of a series of conferences around the country. There were two kids present at one of the conferences who heard it and took it home to their father, Tim Spencer. Spencer, together with a singer named Bob Nolan, also not a famous person, and cowboy actor Roy Rogers, a rather more famous person, together made up this group, the Sons of the Pioneers, pictured on this slide. The Sons of the Pioneers recorded How Great Thou Art. Tim Spencer also owned Manna Music, so he took the recording and promoted it on the radio stations in the U.S. and published the music. George Beverly Shea, standing on the right here, wearing glasses, heard it on the radio and took it to Billy Graham, where it became a popular hymn in the Crusades of the 50s and 60s. But How Great Thou Art did not gain its full popularity until 1967, when Elvis Presley recorded it and won his first Grammy. In fact, Elvis recorded it twice and won a Grammy for both recordings, first time for an album, the second for a single. You know, they don't give Grammys very often for hymns anymore. We all know the now famous and much loved lyrics, "O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, that power throughout the universe has made. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art." And now the tragic story of one of our most beloved hymns, "It Is Well With My Soul." Pictured here, Horatio G. Spafford was a successful lawyer and business person in Chicago with a wife, Anna, and 5 children. On November 21, 1873, the French ocean liner Ville du Havre was crossing the Atlantic from the U.S. to Europe with 313 passengers on board. Among the passengers were Mrs. Spafford and their 4 daughters. Although Spafford had planned to go with his family, he was forced to stay in Chicago and to help solve an unexpected business problem. 4 days out, the boat collided with a powerful iron-hulled Scottish ship, the Loch Erin. Suddenly, all those on board were in grave danger. Anna hurriedly brought her 4 daughters to the deck. She knelt there with Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta and prayed that God would spare them, if that could be his will, or to make them willing to endure whatever awaited. Within 12 minutes, the Ville du Havre slipped beneath the dark waters of the Atlantic, carrying with it 226 of its 331 passengers, including the 4 Spafford children. A sailor rowing a small boat over the spot where the ship went down spotted a woman floating on a piece of the wreckage. It was Anna, still alive. He pulled her into the boat. They were picked up by another large vessel, which 9 days later landed them in Cardiff, Wales. From there, she wired her husband a message which began, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" You can see a picture of that here. Spafford later framed the telegram and placed it in his office. Spafford booked passage on the next available ship and left to join his grieving wife. With the next ship about 4 days out, the captain called Spafford to his cabin and told him they were about on the spot where his children went down. Spafford returned to his stateroom and wrote out the text for "It Is Well With My Soul." Anna later gave birth to 3 more children, one of which died at age 4 of scarlet fever. In August 1881, the Spaffords moved to Jerusalem, where they established a hospital for orphan children, which still exists today, and we can visit next time we're in Jerusalem. Horatio and Anna Spafford died and are buried there. We end our concert with "Now Thank We All Our God." This is a hymn that was born of a war in the midst of a pandemic in the mid-1600s. The author was Martin Rinkart, a Lutheran minister who was serving his hometown of Eilenburg, Germany in the 30 Years' War. You can see a picture of the city here. The walled city of Eilenburg became the refuge for political and military fugitives, with obvious overcrowding, famine, and the Black Plague. In the midst of the war, during the height of the plague in 1637, Rinkart was the only surviving pastor in Eilenburg. He conducted as many as 50 funerals a day. In all, he performed more than 4,000 funerals, including a funeral for his wife. Despite this devastation around him, Rinkart found time to express his faith in the hymn, "Now thank we all our God, with heart and minds and hands and voices, who wondrous things has done, in whom his world rejoices, who from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way, with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today." If we today don't live in constant fear of starvation, the plague, and invading armies, we're already quite a bit more fortunate than Rinkart. And yet, he expresses the thanks to God that we all should feel today for bringing us through this pandemic and pointing us to a safer and happier future.